Welcome to the PB&J podcast, where we talk about topics and issues relevant to the church today. Before we begin this episode, be sure to be sure to subscribe, and also share this. It really helps with the channel. We really appreciate it. And also leave a comment, either down below or through social media or through email if that's your thing. We'll have the information in the description. Let us know what you think about this episode, and also let us know if you have any ideas about what you'd like us to talk about, whether it's related to the church or scripture or what have you. And with that, we're glad you're with us on this episode. Let's jump in. So, the topic we are looking at today was actually motivated by someone who left a comment on one of our Facebook posts. So, thank you to Will Barnhart Jr. for bringing
Yeah.
this up.
Can I say
Uh,
something to Will real quick?
yes,
Hey,
absolutely.
Will, thanks for listening. I know we disagree on some stuff politically, but I appreciate you giving us the time and actually listen to the whole podcast and even giving us something to talk about.
Yes.
Um, that means a lot to me, because I think a lot of times if we're on the other sides of the aisles on stuff, we just tend to walk away and just not care. So thanks for sticking it out and listening. I hope you listen to this one because it is kind of in some sense dedicated to you. So I really appreciate you, man.
Yeah.
Just want to give you a quick shout out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the topic he wanted to bring up it was an interesting one. I wasn't expecting it.
I like it.
Um, and well, I can't speak for you. I've thought about it a lot because it opens up so many doors. But the general topic was what should happen to a pastor who has a serious moral failing when they're in their position of pastoring? Like, should they just be kicked out of the church?
Mm,
Or what happens fairly frequently, I think, is when pastors mess up, they just sort of get moved to a new position, which is interesting. Some pastors do get disciplined, but a lot of them just sort of move. Sometimes they fail upwards, and you get really bad pastors actually end up taking leadership positions just to shift them out of whatever position they were in. I mean, it's a very interesting question. The specific example
yeah.
was a pastor who had an affair, and rather than receiving what was perceived as discipline, the leadership just moved him to another church, and he just sort of got away with it, I guess. That was the example, and I've seen stuff like that happen, so I'm not saying it's an outlandish example. It's not. It happens. So that's sort of setting the stage of what we're talking about. And so we want to talk a little bit about justice and grace. And if you watch our pre-show, which we recorded, you'll probably get an inkling that there's a lot of
Here's some
directions
tidbits.
this conversation could go. So
Yeah.
that's setting the stage.
Can I Yeah, can I lay out the issue and how we're approaching it? Is that
Yeah.
okay?
Yep.
And then you can jump on the first section. The first, I guess, it would be kind of like first point. So essentially, for us, we're laying this out as the difference between justice and grace, and where the church falls on these spectrums, and then uh, to what extent the church and the people in the church can and do and should administer justice, right? And then also to what extent grace covers some of those things. So we'll kind of piece that together. Does that you think it's a good layout, Ben, for what we're talking about? Because I feel like that's how I see the issue. That's what this is about, right? Like it's a
Yeah.
moral wrongdoing and it negatively affects the church. So what is
Mhm.
the justice? Like what is it that we want to administer for breaking, your pledge, not only as a minister, but as a member of the denomination or whatever, or the church body? What is your what's the word I'm looking for? Punishment? I don't want to say punishment. It seems harsh. Penalty.
Yeah.
What is the
What are
penance?
what are the
Consequences.
consequences
There you
for
go.
yeah, for
Words.
messing up?
I need a
Yes.
thesaurus.
Right. It's weird because yeah, that line of justice and grace, because you can't go too far either way. Justice without grace is tyranny, and grace without justice is just lawlessness. So I mean,
It's
it's true
enabling,
though.
you know?
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's essentially what Paul was saying. So I don't know. I'm not okay. So I guess using that specific example as a launching point for the conversation, it's on the surface of it. Yeah, the pastor messed up, and there should, I feel, be some consequence for something like that because that affects, not just the pastor's family, but the whole church. And it's like, if he's going to have that sort of moral failing in his personal life, then what is he teaching in his churches? Can you even trust him to lead a congregation? I think that's a serious question you can ask. And I think it should have, you know, some consequences. But is that an example, moving a pastor from one church to another because they messed up and having no real consequences for that? Is that just enabling it? Or is the church taking advantage of the idea of, well, let's just show grace and just wipe and wash our hands of this and let God deal with it?
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's a position some people take too. Like they over maybe they offer too much grace because they use grace as an excuse to not have to think too much about it and actually make a hard decision. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of, and I don't want to be harsh, but I might be on accident, so forgive me. I call
Mm,
them pop level Christians. That's really
mm,
mean. That like, God will forgive me. Don't judge me. God loves me. That was I think that's kind of died a little bit. That was like really trendy like circa '07.
yeah,
Like I remember that like in high school people saying stuff like that a lot more than I hear it now. But like it was
I,
the idea that like, oh, since I can't, I'm not the arbiter of justice, God is, like that means we just don't address anything at all. And it's like, well, I mean,
yeah,
it's not okay.
you're right. Yeah, I think it still has holdouts in the being authentic movement, which is still sort of
Mm,
around. And I don't know if it was powerful, it was insightful. Someone said
ooh,
authenticity is a new hypocrisy. And I remember at a big youth conference,
dang,
Nazarene
dude,
Youth Conference, it was
harsh.
in Phoenix, Arizona. And I remember there was a band that was there. One of the band members was on the stage and he was just talking to the crowd, and he made reference to how, yeah, like we were hanging out as a band and we were talking, we got pretty upset with each other and we said some words we shouldn't say, sometimes you do that. And you just blah 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 blah. And it was just so like treated so casually. And to me I was just like, uh that was the example I went to when I heard that, and I was like, okay, like there's a lot of people making excuses for their imperfections, just saying, well, I'm just being authentic. It's like, well, it sounds like you're just using that as an excuse to not try and improve yourself, or to not face the reality that, maybe there are some things about me that I shouldn't make excuses for, and recognize, what, that was wrong.
Yeah.
And we just say, well, I'm just being authentic as an excuse. And we're already off the rails on this one.
No,
Uh,
no, no, not at all. Like, no, but like you're making a point, and I think it's good to frame it. We need to frame the issue a little bit. So, like, one side, I've never heard the authenticity thing. I also don't go to a lot of like youth conferences, so it's probably part of the reason. But like, what you're really talking about is like the inability or the lack of desire or the fear of maybe even addressing a sin in somebody's life.
yeah.
Um, I I think with any kind of, because to some extent this is a moral decision, right? Because sin's a moral issue for Christians, or at least particularly evangelicals, specifically Nazarenes, even
Yeah.
beyond that, is that anytime there's a moral issue for me, like if you devoid it from its context, it doesn't make a lot of sense, right? If you just got mad at somebody and you had a little spitting match, that's probably wrong. That's petty, that's different than like, I don't know. I'm trying to think about it. I feel like name calling generally is pretty much always wrong because this is not a lot to justify. Also, it's just petty.
Yeah.
Maybe we could take the issue a touch more serious. Let's talk about the moral failure. Can we go back to that example, Ben? Do you think
Yeah.
that's okay?
Yeah,
So
sure.
for us on this side, like I think what we would be saying, it'd be like it would be wrong if a pastor had a moral failure and the church just covered it up and swept it under the rug, or they were just like, you know what? So like I'm trying to think of a context which it would be wrong. I think the context I would argue would be wrong was if they said people do it, that's okay.
Mhm.
And there wasn't like any desire to make amends in the marriage. There wasn't any involvement with the church. Maybe, and I think a pastor to some extent, if they got caught with a moral failure, because they are a public figure in a small sense, right, in that local body, like they would to some extent owe an apology because it's very obviously hypocritical and it just doesn't. Well, it's wrong and it feels wrong to be listening to somebody to give you moral advice when they can't even live up to their own moral advice. You know what I mean? It
Yeah.
just it really invalidates your credibility. And that's kind of the point that we're really arguing here is that like it would invalidate that like the truth claims that we're proclaiming, especially if you're preaching from the pulpit, like you're proclaiming this truth. And the argument is that in some sense you are living up to proof by failing, but at the same time not addressing it and just saying, oh, I'm going to continue to fail is kind of enabling, right? That's kind of
Yeah.
a debate that actually you and I have been having in our pre-show that we won't get into at this moment. But like that's not a good place to be. Is really what we're
Yeah.
saying. Is that what we're trying to frame on this side, Ben? Is that what you're getting with authenticity culture?
Yeah,
Authenticity
pretty
culture.
much.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool.
Sort of Yeah. Um, but man, this is okay. So this was a tough topic to tackle
It's
because
big.
we're not just talking about the example we were given to touch on. It wasn't just talking about where's the line of grace and justice in the church. It was specifically talking about what do you do with church leaders who have moral failings, and that's
Yeah, I
actually
know.
a very complicated subject. I wish it wasn't. Um, and I want
I like the
to
context though.
yes. So I want to give a concrete example of one that I'm indirectly familiar with. One that I keep thinking of when talking about this. So this was something that did happen several years ago. There was a fairly large church. I think it was the children's pastor of that church. Some people listening will know exactly what I'm talking about and who I'm talking about, and I'm okay with that. And they went on this I think it was young I think it was youth. It doesn't matter. It was working with minors, someone who was a leader over minors. They went on a trip, and this leader had very inappropriate, contact and conversations and relations with the young people. The the students came back, they told their parents, the parents went to the church board, I believe, or that pastor. Anyways, they went to leadership and they were like, so this happened. This is what our young people are telling us, and you need to deal with this." And the church board basically did nothing, sort of swept it under the rug. A lot of people got upset. There were other staff pastors who heard about it and
Mhm,
or who were even sort of in the periphery of what happened. So like they knew the stories, they believed the stories. They went to the head pastor. They told the head pastor, and the head pastor screamed at least one or two staff people. Like literally screamed at them. They ended up quitting, and then people went to the district leadership, told them about it because nothing was happening. Like everyone was just trying to sweep it under the rug, no big deal. And the district didn't do anything about it either. They were just like, "Yeah, well, these might be real. We're not gonna do anything." And then, a little while after that, this pastor who was accused of this went before the church and says, "Hey, it's a great thing. I've been offered this position to be the director of a children's camp at so and so, the great opportunity," which part of it was just, I'm sure, the board being like, "Dude, you gotta get out of here, because this is not gonna look good." Um, and long story short, the parents ended up calling that camp. They nixed that agreement because they're like, okay, we can't hire you because you have these accusations against you. The pastor received, like the head pastor who did nothing about the situation, received no discipline. Um, and he's still leading that church today. And a lot of people have lost trust in not just him, but also the district
mhm.
individuals who were involved because they did nothing. And it's still frustrating for me. It didn't even affect me personally, but I know people who were affected, and it's frustrating when you see that happen. It's okay. Here is a clear moral issue, something that happened, and leaders that we trust to take care of this did nothing. And that's annoying because like something needs to happen, especially in a situation like that. But I will say it did open my eyes a little bit to the fact that unfortunately politics have a big role in how churches function and how
Mhm.
leadership functions. This is a very prominent church, so I'm sure the district leadership was like, "You know what? I really don't wanna get caught up in this because it could be my job on the line if I'm just guessing, but I know these conversations and these thoughts take place because when I've had to do discipline within my own church, I've thought these things. It happens. At the end of the day, people look after what's best for them, and they only see from their own perspective, and I'm not justifying it. I'm just saying that's what everybody does, right? Even
It's the
victims do
default
that.
switch.
Yeah, it's the default switch. It's like, okay, what can I do here that is the easiest for me? And people always want to do that. And it leads a lot of times in the church to not doing anything. It's like, you know what? This will blow over. I don't want to, this is going to blow up. It's going to be awful. So just whatever, don't do it again and we'll call it good. And that happens a lot in churches and I think it's messed up. And so it doesn't surprise me when people in the church and outside of the church want the government to have oversight in church affairs. Um, I kind of get it. I don't agree with it, but I get where that comes from because a lot of church leaders they they make pretty big mistakes like that, and it seems to happen frequently when it comes to issues that should be clear, like black and white, this is wrong, and church leaders just don't do anything about it, and it's so frustrating. And, yeah, and it's almost like there's no accountability there. It's
Mm.
weird. It's annoying. And it happens on the
Yeah,
local
and it
level
just erodes
too.
trust. Yeah, I know.
Like, even local churches, I've seen horror stories where pastors are abusing their position, and it's like nothing happens. No one cares. So what do you do? And what's that situation look like? So, maybe that's a bit
Crazy.
more concrete. I don't know how clear that whole thing was. I understand it pretty well, so maybe I didn't talk about it. I don't know. Did that come through all right?
No, it made
I was
sense. It made sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I'm basically just saying
you
when it
kept it
comes
high level
to
and honest.
yeah, I guess I'm just saying when it comes to church leadership and when they make big mistakes,
It's a different
it's
discussion.
yeah, it's a very different discussion than just what does justice and grace look like?
Yeah,
Because now you're dealing with church
yeah,
politics, and that's all complicated. And
yeah.
sometimes,
Well, I mean, you're
unfortunately, at
all
the end of the
yeah.
day, it's like, what do you do?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Well, I think let's contextualize this because Will asked a good point. You're right. You're right. We got to contextualize it. We got to put it in its context, which is what Will's question is. What do we do specifically for church leaders? Like, if a layperson has a moral failure, I don't know that they owe the congregation an apology. They owe somebody an apology,
Mhm.
but not the congregation. But they're also not in a leadership position. They're not taking some kind of responsibility at a organized level. Maybe if they had a small group, they'd apologize to them for not being able to live up to the thing. But like if they're not a leader per se of some form, they don't owe anybody an apology. Whereas a pastor is explicitly a shepherd of a flock, right? Like that you are explicitly trying to guide and lead and design a church to grow people's faith. So if you failed like that and there's no accountability, it's a significantly different situation because there's people that are relying on you to some extent to give them that guidance and wisdom so that they can make I don't know what's the right word, the best spiritual decision. I don't know, like or like to make to live life as they ought to, I guess, if that makes sense. Is that
Yeah.
am I clear on that, Ben? Have we framed one this side enough? Do we want to get to the opposite of like lay down the law, or do you want to give any more examples on this side?
Hmm. Maybe as a transition, I wanna share a story.
Smooth transition on Ben's
Yeah,
part, not
I'll
on mine.
I'll try. This was the only time I saw a simultaneous, discipline and reconciliation at a church. The only time I can think of that was this public, and when I tell the story, it's gonna sound crazy. I think it's crazy that it happened in a good way. I'm glad I was there. I was, like, 8 or 9 or 10 at the time. I was really young. But the church I was in, it was a Sunday evening service too, and there was a couple in the church, 2 couples, sorry, a couple of couples in the church, and they were, like, having, uh I was still young, so I don't know the exact context, but they were having conversations about, like, essentially swapping spouses and just heading out. Like, the wife from one would marry the husband from the other and, really, like, swinging, basically swapping, and, uh, I'm assuming the pastor orchestrated it. And he no, not the relationships, he orchestrated the service, sorry, where and in the service, these 2 couples, publicly said they told the church, "You know what? This is what we've been doing. This is what's going on. This is what we've talked about, and we really messed up, and this is wrong." And, like, I remember sitting there, it's, like, burned in my memory, like, the 2 husbands, coming together and, like, apologizing to each other, the 2 wives doing the same thing, like and the church was there as, like, just witnessing this happen, and, like, on the one hand, it was, like, people acknowledging, "Man, we really messed up," and also it was, "Yeah, we messed up, but we wanna move on from this and move forward," and it was such a beautiful picture,
Oh, it was
and
beautiful because it sounds terrifying to me.
yeah, which I'm like, I don't know who decided that was a good idea, but I'm glad that they actually did it because what a great example to set for everybody else. They're like, you know what? Yeah, you need to be called out on your mistakes and you need to confess it, but there's also grace and reconciliation that can happen. And that was such a beautiful thing and a great example to me as a kid to see like, and I still carry it with me today that like, yeah, people make really dumb decisions, but they can always come back from it. Like you actually can move forward with something as awful as that was, and you don't have to be bitter and angry about it all the time. Like you can actually make amends. Like that is a possibility. Maybe that's why sometimes I'm optimistic about things and cautious of being too judgmental. But um, I say that to say that was the only time I experienced it, and I imagine it's because actually pursuing that sort of thing, where on the one hand you call out something that was messed up, and you make a public affirmation that you know what, this was a messed up thing that happened in the church, but we need to draw attention to it. We can't ignore it, and we need to pave a way forward. I imagine that doesn't happen because it's incredibly uncomfortable, and pastors are generally not good at being uncomfortable, especially when other people are involved. I think it feels to a pastor like you're intruding on their space when it's like, actually, maybe this should happen. Maybe the
Mhm.
church should know that this is going on, because there's opportunity to teach here, and there's opportunity for growth, and you need to do this. That and it takes work, and there could be major backlash from it. So I imagine the reason why in churches where leaders are not let me back up a little bit. Where big situations, major errors are not talked about and they're sort of pushed under the rug, I imagine it's because people just don't like being uncomfortable, and pastors especially. And as a pastor, I need to own that. Be like, you know what? Those situations are uncomfortable, but I also feel like they're necessary. And I feel like that's what Will's saying too. Like there should have been some sort of discipline, some sort of act here that actually called that pastor out on it, but no one did it. And I imagine it's because it's uncomfortable, and it's like, well, we'll just move them. We'll pretend it didn't happen. And maybe that's a transition to the next point. I don't know. That's
No,
my
I get
story.
what you're saying. So let's talk about the no, you're good. It's a good story. It's illustrating the points. Let's talk about the other side of this though, the
Yeah.
like, one strike you're out type deals or the
Mm.
zero tolerance policies or whatever. I hate zero tolerance policy because that word is loaded with meaning for people. Some people really hate it, some people really love it. But the idea it's a one strike you're out. We'll use that phrase.
Mhm.
That seems also wrong to me. It seems trying to I don't have an example because I just don't know a church that well actually I do know a church. I don't feel comfortable sharing the story. I don't because
Okay.
some of those details are raw and there's some people that I know listen that were involved. So but it was about a church leader at a moral failure and the calls for that person's position pretty quickly.
Mm.
Um and some of the aftermath. But my point is like when you hammer down and there's no nuance or public acknowledgement or anything like that, it becomes a question of like what was it wasn't the right thing, and then it becomes I think for people like how much did I like or not like this person, or how much do I think that the church valued them, and what it doesn't do is it doesn't provide a good model for grace. So Ben, that story about that moral failure, that couple that came public, when you were telling that story, I was sitting there literally like wanting to pull my hair out, like, oh my goodness, this looks like something that should be on a reality show and it's going to blow up in their faces. This is going to be a nightmare scenario. And you're like, no, it was actually really beautiful because it modeled for us grace and you showed like, and I think that's the middle of this, right? Like it showed like what accountability looks like in a healthy level when it needs to be public. We talk about it publicly,
Mhm.
right? So especially with the church leader, because they have public responsibility, it needs to be talked about publicly. But moreover, like it also showed what grace looks like. Hey, as a body, look, guess what we can all do together right now? We can forgive them and we can love them and we can trust to help them like figure this out and
Mhm.
move forward, right? And that's a right thing to do, right? Like that's what we talk about grace, the Holy Spirit. I think that's what that means. I think that's just kind of part of it. Um, so when we're talking about the hardline responses, I think we're talking more about like, Ben, can I just say it? You,
Mhm.
you talked about it in prep, kind of the cancel culture a little bit.
Sure.
So this is not a partisan thing. So no trigger warnings. I'm not trying to make anybody upset, but like it's a natural human response
Mhm.
when something of not just offends us, but well, I will say offend because offend doesn't just mean emotional, but like you have a moral sensibility that's not like it has emotional triggers, like it has an emotional response, but it comes from a deep, I would argue it comes from a deeper rooted place. It's not like, hey, Ben, I hate your hat. It's tacky. Like I don't actually hate your hat, but like, you know what I'm saying? Like that's just offensive. Like I'm just hurting your feelings and I'm calling your arbitrary sense of fashion tacky,
Yeah.
right? Versus when I'm like, that is wrong. You did the wrong thing, emphasis on the finger pointing. You did the wrong thing. Like that is offensive in the sense that it is directly contradicting the choice that you made or the action that you took or both at the same time, right? and saying that you did something incorrect. So I am like in that sense offending, attacking, going after, I'm approaching, reproaching, whatever the phrase that you want to use is, that moral decision. So for cancel culture, I think we tend to think about it as like on the internet, we get mad when someone doesn't agree with us. I think that's a little ridiculous. Like people are always going to disagree with you. I'm sorry, man. Like trying to get someone fired from their economic job, even if it's a high paying job, seems a little odd.
Yeah.
Hold on. Well, actually, I don't know if I fully agree with my own point here. Some cancel culture is more healthy than others. I don't really
Yes.
want to piece that out on Twitter, like how Twitter works and how Facebook works and how social media trends work right now. That's not my point of my argument. My point is that there's a similarity between that and someone who sits in a church pew, hears about their pastor having a moral failure, and they're gone forever. They're done. They should never minister again. They've invalidated the totality of their ministry. That kind of harsh judgment and that kind of black and white sense of justice, I think, is contradictory to God's sense of justice, because you can't talk about God's justice without talking about God's grace, which is why your story about that those two couples that had done that weird thing and then like that the swing to reswing to swing back. I don't know how to phrase that. I'm not trying to be funny. I don't know how to describe that situation.
Yeah.
Those couples that made that thing and had that reconciliation, that redemption moment with each other and with their spouses and with the church, and like as awkward and as weird as it is, because it is uncomfortable, was good, and it was encouraging, and it was a model, and it was explanation of that. Versus like if we had taken a hardline judgment, that moment could never have occurred, or if we didn't enable it, again, that moment could never would have occurred. So I think that what we're first saying is that you can't devoid the situation of context, and you can't too devoid it of grace, because if you're not approaching something from like the point of view of grace, like
Mhm.
forgiveness and reconciliation and moving forward and love and care and like genuine concern for the other person and their like internal security, but their needs and the feel, not just feelings, but like their like status as a person now. There's a lot to unpack there. I don't know how to get into it because I'm not an ethicist, but I think that you're not fundamentally speaking about or for or in a Christian context, if that
Mhm.
makes sense. Did that make sense, man? That got really, really heady and really high level.
Yeah. No, it's fine.
Okay.
I'm gonna launch off of that. I'd like to build off of what you're talking about by sharing. Man, now I'm getting like a bunch of stories in my head, and it's great, but
I'm
also
glad you got all the stories because I don't have a lot of examples. And if I do have examples, I don't really feel comfortable sharing them.
so this was a good friend of mine, is a good friend of mine still, even though they don't live in the area anymore. They so this person and their I think they were engaged at the time. This person was a pastor in a church, and uh, they went on a trip with their fiance to I don't know exactly where, and I think they used the same hotel room. They had separate beds, and this is a person where Jordan, you know this person too. If I were to share who it was, you'd be like, okay, like that makes sense. Like this person, I'm not saying anything negative about them. They'd probably even admit it too. Sometimes they do things without really thinking it through, but they're not it doesn't it's not actually what it looks like on the surface. So anyways, the church found out, someone in the church found out that this happened, that they shared a hotel room, went to the pastor, and the pastor just fired him. Just just totally fired him. The board, I think yeah, the pastor went to the board, told them about the situation, says we're going to fire them, and they were not in this conversation at all. This friend of mine, like they showed up at church one day and were just basically told, "Yeah, you don't have a job anymore." And there's like, "Why? Like what happened?" And not only that, but the pastor like openly just bashed them relentlessly from the pulpit on a Sunday morning
Oh man.
and like gave them no room to talk, anything like that. And it's just and it was one of those situations where like, okay, that was a dumb thing to do, but this person, I know them well enough to be like, okay, yeah, that was a bad decision, but I believe them when they said they didn't have any sexual interaction.
Bad idea, but a good heart, like
Yeah, and it's like, just you just have to know that person, yeah, that was a dumb thing to do, they openly admitted, "You know what, that was stupid, we didn't do anything, I know it looks like that, we didn't do anything, we didn't cross those lines, it looks really bad, it was a dumb thing to do, I totally get that." And, like, that's what they were saying, but they were given no opportunity to explain, they were given no pathway to being reinstated in the church, like, nothing, just totally gone, and vilified in the process, which was even worse. And it reminds me of a phrase I heard by, Say Goodnight Kevin, who's a good YouTuber, and he said, "No one's a villain in their own story." And I think that's something that we tend to forget,
Mhm.
is sometimes people just make dumb decisions. It's not like they're just totally evil at heart, it's just sometimes they just do stupid things, and we tend to just look at their immediate action and just be like, "Okay, you should be canceled for this. Like, you should totally lose your job because this was a major mistake." It's like, maybe it's a bit more involved in that. Like,
Yeah.
maybe they were just being totally oblivious to what was going on, and they didn't realize what was happening until it was too late. And, yeah, there should be consequences to that, but do you just totally write them off because you only see sort of the end product of what might have been a very confusing and oblivious journey that this person was on. Um, so I'll just throw that out there.
No, I think that was really well said, and that's the kind of the whole point. Like, if you did, like, I mean, this person didn't get a chance to defend themselves, their reputation, or even like the ministry or the validity of the other person. Because like, there's two parties involved in this whole thing. That person doesn't sound like they got much of a chance to defend themselves either. You know, now you think
No.
terrible things about two people,
Yeah.
right? Because no grace was given. So I think that we got to resist the urge to drop the hammer. That's what I mean by that. You know, I
Yeah.
mean, that, to me, I wonder if this, and Ben, I need you to, because you're an actual pastor and you're a much better biblical scholar just in general than I am, because I'm not a scholar at all. But you have a master's degree. So with that said, like, I wonder if this is what it means by like, turning the other cheek, or at least this would be an example at a
Mm,
personal level, like what that could be for us, like as a church, to turn the other cheek a little bit. Because like that's an affront to our senses and to our sense of morality. And it's an affront to what we believe in our following of you know, right? It's hypocrisy. It's wrong.
mm,
But, you know, in that moment, like you can strike back, or you can say, okay, what's going on? Sorry, that I if you were watching the YouTube video, I did a really dramatic head turn that was really dumb. So forgive me if you saw that and if you heard it.
I thought it worked, so I don't
Uh,
mind.
okay, cool. I'm glad. Okay, I'm glad Ben thinks it worked. Hopefully, it worked. I don't know. Anyway, the main point is that like you can turn the other cheek, which means to like be willing to take some more and like keep going and like continue that assault, because maybe we could find out a little more what's going on here. And I think, man, I'm really glad you shared that story about that couple, or those two couples, because like it's messy. It's messy stuff,
Mhm.
you know? That's kind of the whole point. And I think when you make like, and this isn't like one of those arguments like, oh, all morals are gray. Some things are clearly wrong. Some things are clearly not. Come on,
Yeah.
I'm not like let's not. We're not doing that. We're not playing that game. The game that I do want to play, I'm just kidding, it's not a game, is that like the reality of these issues isn't so black and white, because you got to understand it in light of what's going on in front of it. Like if you just heard that rumor of the story you just shared about the minister who just really didn't think at all. Like I'm just like I was literally like shaking my head. I was just thinking to myself, "Oh my gosh, like what are you doing? Like why would that even occur to you? Why would it even come to your mind that like no one's going to care? You know,
Mhm.
like of course people are going to care, you know? It's like a 2 and 2 always gets 4, dude. If you get 3, you're doing something wrong. But somehow, you know, we do bad math sometimes, and I don't think we should fail every test because we missed one problem, so to speak. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
oh gosh, that story cracks me up. But you know, the bigger point here, at least the bigger point I think here, is that if you don't inject that element of grace by understanding what's going on, more to the point, by giving the other person a chance to explain what's happening and to confront it and to hear it in its totality, you don't one know that you're actually, you know, getting retribution or penance or consequences for the right action. Because if you don't know, you're just punishing blindly. I know
Mhm.
justice is blind, but that's not the kind of blind that it means. It means blind to like, well, this is an American thing, so I might even get into that because that's not relevant to us churches. So never mind. Justice is not blind in that sense, especially God's justice, because
Yeah.
luckily God's omnipotent and omniscient, so
Right.
you didn't have to worry about that. Anyway,
Yeah.
sorry, neither here nor there. Does that make sense, Ben? Are we? Are
Yeah.
we? Have we said enough on this one? Or do you want to keep going?
Uh, yeah, I mean, basically, yeah, context matters, and you're right.
Yeah,
Like, when we see moral failings like that, I think you had a good response to it. Instead of just, "Let's drop the hammer," maybe we need to ask, "So what's really going on here?"
yeah, and it
And
might be to drop the
sometimes, yeah,
hammer.
the hammer does need to drop pretty hard. Like in the example I gave of the church where the pastor was, uh, having inappropriate contact with minors. Like, yeah, the hammer needs to drop in that case because
Yeah,
it's
for
pretty open
sure.
shut, and there's no defending what happened, and it was clear the whole thing
No
was
room
just
for nuance there.
messed up. Yeah. Um, but yeah, sometimes it's just like there needs to be more to the story. And I think in both ways, sometimes we can be too quick to act. We're too quick to drop the hammer. Sometimes we're too quick to just dole out grace, if I could say that. So I was like, "Oh no,
Mm,
we'll just give him a break on this one." It's like maybe not. Maybe something should happen here, you know?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, it's I'm just thinking about that. Too quick to Joel. Yeah, I would say part of me wonders. Here's another question, Ben, that's not on our prep, but hear me out.
Yeah.
I wonder if there is such a thing as grace if it doesn't include justice.
I don't think so.
Hmm.
Um,
I
grace
just thought of
without grace without justice is it doesn't mean anything. There's no value
that.
to it, right?
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah. So I guess we would say grace is a more encompassing concept than justice.
Yeah.
Justice is narrow in scope. Interesting.
Yeah.
Sorry, I just thought of that.
No, it's fine. And I
Yeah.
get it. It's a hard line to walk.
Yeah.
But I do want to share maybe an I don't know if this I don't know if this relates or not.
No, go ahead and throw
Um,
it out there. Why not?
but I also think in these stories where church leaders make really messed up decisions, and let's say they really mess up, like they full on no excuse for it. The hammer needs to fall, and let's say someone drops the hammer, and it's like okay, you need to get out of here. Um, I also think the church misses out on an opportunity to see redemption happen if
Mm.
we totally close doors on those situations. So I'll give another example, another story that came to mind. There was a, a similar situation, two couples at a different church I was a part of, and
Dude, how do you have all these
it
stories?
wasn't both members of the couples. It was just one from each couple started having an affair, and they were both leaders in the church. These individuals, and it came out very suddenly that oh these people were having affairs and those people just left the church. I don't know if they were asked to leave, I assume so, but they just left and we never heard anything else about them, but their family still went to the church. And I remember sitting in a room with one of the family members, this was several years later, and mentioning how frustrated they were with the church that because what happened in the meantime is this couple that had an affair, they actually ended up getting married. Like they divorced their spouse and they got married together. So they didn't just have an affair, they ended up getting married because of it and yada yada. But someone in the church
Oh,
mentioned they were really someone in the family mentioned they were frustrated with the church because the church failed to recognize that there was actually good things happening, as messed up as the situation was, that the church was failing to recognize, and they just didn't even wanna acknowledge because they were like, "Oh, no, there was an affair, we don't wanna touch that situation anymore." Because what had happened and this person was like, "Look, I don't defend what my parent did. Like, they walked out on us, and they ended up marrying someone from another couple, and that was messed up, and there's a lot of pain there. But also, as a result, like, I have a step family now, and so, like, we have those relationships with them, and actually, we've ended up mending a lot of our relationships with those parents, and yeah, it's a bit awkward because now, like, they're still married, and they tried to justify and be like, "Well, we actually felt like the best thing to do in that situation was to get married, like, we weren't trying to ruin anyone's life, it just sorta happened," and it's like, "Okay, that's you're thinking like an idiot, but it happened." And as weird as that situation is, like, there was reconciliation that took place, but the church didn't wanna even talk about it because, well, there was an affair that took place, so now we don't even wanna visit that situation anymore. And so I think closing the door on those
hmm.
and being like, "Okay, that was a clear moral failure. Yes, there was some punishment that needed to happen and some punishment did, but then do we totally shut the door on anything that happens after that and not recognize, like, yeah, it's a weird situation, but yeah, there's some positive things that have happened since then, and maybe we should acknowledge those too."
Hmm.
I don't know. I admit that's a weird
No,
one,
it's a good
but I
story.
imagine those things are fairly common where
Well, I think it's just a recognition that part of the messiness, God can really, that's what redemption is, right? Like
Mm,
we trust that God's going to make those things right and turn them into as right as they can be. And you're right. Like we have to acknowledge the reality that like maybe we don't. It's always really weird when like someone marries a partner of an affair, but that's created a new sense of family. They've been able to heal in some ways and move forward. And that's emblematic of what God can do and just the resiliency of people when those things happen, you know. And then like what happens when you let things go and like how it can open up new possibilities, right? And that sounds like really like kind of like fluffy and high and like nice and neat, you know, I don't want to devoid it from the pain that you just described. Like, can you imagine how resentful they were for the longest time? And even probably
mm,
sometimes now maybe they'll get that twinge in the back of their mind when someone says something or makes a joke or something, and they're like, "Arr," you know, I don't know. I don't
mhm,
know this family. They're probably, you know, they're maybe further beyond that. Maybe they're not. I don't know. But like, but think about like what they're modeling for people. Like, hey, in the midst of like this kind of pain and turmoil and ugliness, like good things can still come about, you
mhm.
know, and I think that level of optimism is something that Christians got to recapture a little bit sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it
Mm.
reminds me, like, how many people praise King David? It was like, "Oh, well, King David was a man after God's own heart." It's like,
Yeah,
dude,
that
he
dude
made
was
some
a
really bad decisions.
disaster.
Like,
He murdered a person and
yeah,
slept with his wife at the
yeah.
same time.
Like, if he was a pastor, he would be gone. But then look at how many people, like, look up to him, and I think part of that too is perspective. Like, because with David, like, we know the whole story, right? So we can look at those weak parts and be like, "Okay, yeah, that's messed up," but also look what came of that.
Weak
But when
seems like a little
we
bit of an undersell, but yeah, I get your
Yeah,
point.
but when we, but when we experience things and when we witness things happen in our own lives from people, like people we would look up to or even ourselves, we look at just the instance and we fail to take a step back and even ask the question, as wrong as this is, but what could happen if grace were to take place here and if we just didn't fully
Mm,
condemn this person for all of eternity? Like what could actually come
yeah.
about because
Or
of this? And I think that's a question that a lot of
yeah,
that we need to ask in those situations.
that's good. That's good stuff. I like it. Mm.
Yeah. But
It's
like
the
even David
transformative
faced
power of grace.
discipline
It
for
doesn't
what he
just work
did.
for those outside the church. Yes, he
Yeah.
did, and he should have.
Yeah. And it was harsh discipline. Like the child that he lost their baby and then it was messed up. And he got
Yeah, it's
called
not
out
good.
on it. Yeah. So, but I think that also goes back to, the whole balance between grace and justice. But David had to be called out on it before he like actually acknowledged, yeah, I made a mistake. Like,
He was content to let it ride, you know,
yeah.
like
And I think that's something too, is I do think that more often than not, at least in my experience, church leaders tend to not get called out on things because it's uncomfortable.
yeah.
So we don't even create the opportunity for there to be repentance in many cases. And I think that's the case that Will was referencing, is this pastor who had an affair wasn't even called out on it. He was just sort of brushed under the rug. It's like, well, if you don't call someone out on it, then how can you create room for reconciliation and repentance? And maybe that's something that we're overlooking here too. I don't know.
That's a good point too. Because, like, you know, if they're not called out on it, and so because we talked about that one side about like the hammer, but let's talk about the enabling because that's really what the analogy is here, right? They're not called out on it.
Yeah.
It just ignores the sense of the part of grace that involves reconciliation.
Hmm.
You know, there's no reconciliation, there's no fix, and you just have this overhanging problem that continues to sit there. And then I think that anger, and this is not has no background, just life experience nonsense. So my opinion on something, not that all this isn't my opinion, but this even more so should be carried with less weight than the rest of my stuff, I suppose. Like I just feel like when you let most people tend to simmer on their anger, it tends to boil and fester, and the longer it goes unaddressed and untouched, the more angry they feel and the more unjust they feel, whether it's rational or not. It's not relevant in the moment. It takes over you and just kind of owns you and consumes you. And the point of this is that it could have been solved, or it can be solved, by having those moments of reconciliation regardless, of what's going on, because then you insert, I think, the reality of right and wrong, and moving forward and trying to find a way, and knowing that the things that were hurt and leveled against you, that they like were at least acknowledged at the minimum and
Mm.
addressed moving forward, and the person that did it or the parties involved like genuinely didn't intend or if they did intend, are willing to ask for forgiveness for the hurt that they've caused. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was good. So yeah, I never thought a conversation on this could go
Kind
into
of glad I
these
went the way it
topics.
did, to be honest.
Yeah, I think these are conversations that need to take place
Yeah.
because again, yeah, I think some of what we're saying is we tend to go too far one way or the other when the right way is more towards the middle, and it's a lot messier there,
Mhm.
which is I think why we tend to avoid it and just go for the extremes. I
Yeah.
wish I wish I
Part of
knew
me,
of a good example, like
part of
from
me
my
sometimes,
personal experience of someone
yeah.
who was really good at walking towards it. Actually, I think the pastor that of the church where that story I mentioned earlier of those 2 couples,
Mhm.
that I think he's a good example of someone who can do that. But a lot of people don't. I think because it's messy and it needs a lot of wisdom, but it also needs, like, a lot of strength to be able to be like, "No, we need to call this out. This needs to happen." And those are tough.
Good
So,
leader, good
yeah,
pastor.
yeah. So, okay, maybe in a way to make this practical, maybe here's a question, and I don't even know if we have an answer to it. But what I don't even know how to ask the question. What should the response be by, someone in the church, just your average layperson, when they see a moral failing that's just not being addressed?
So, okay, so let's say that they are, I don't know, like best friends with a person. So, like, let me make sure I understand the question you're asking. Like, let's say a person's best friends with another person in the church. Let's say they're two women and we have a male pastor, and like male pastor and woman B are having an affair, and woman A is the person we're talking about, and they know about it because they're best friends with woman B.
Mm,
Like, what is her, like, how should she respond?
mm.
Is that what you're
Well,
asking?
I guess since the general topic is church leaders, I
Okay.
guess we'll talk about, okay, if that person was in a position of
Oh,
leadership in the
and
church, then
okay.
how would you address it if you knew
Well,
about it?
yeah, if you're a pastor and one of your staff members are having an affair and you're aware of it, I I feel like you have to, at least at the very least, talk to them first.
Mm,
Like, you have to approach them and reprimand them about it. I think you would hope that they would come out on their own. I personally, like, this. I don't know if this is the right or wrong thing. Maybe then we can kind of sort that out. But I would be like, I'm going to tell the rest of the staff, provided there is more staff, or and Pasta and the board, because this is not right, and we've made a commitment to not do that, and we can't no, not even risk. It is wrong for us to make the claims that we do from the pulpit and from our leadership position
mm,
without at least acknowledging and abiding by, to the best of our ability, those moral principles, right? I'm not
yeah,
saying you have to be perfect, but you got to, like, do it. And if you're not going to come out and say it because there is a failure, and this is a pretty big one, that you don't typically stumble into that easily, like, for this pace, like, I guess really we're talking about affairs right now, to be honest, in some sense, but it's more than that. Like, it's say embezzling, even embezzling is a pretty
yeah.
big deal. It's
Mhm.
terrible.
Oh, it
Uh,
happens, yeah.
what
I
happens a
was
lot.
interviewed for a church where that was part of their history, so
That's rough.
it was weird.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But, like, even then, like, I would just be like, "Hey, I'm gonna say something, but I'm gonna give you like a week and a half. I'm gonna give you like 2 weeks or something, or a week, to not just get ahead of it, but to, like, do this."
Yeah.
And then I would say I probably would have already told at least one person, asked them to keep it secret in the hopes that you give it out so that there's 2 people, that, like, are
Mm,
aware of what's going on. And
mm,
then I would try to get, if I can, any kind of proof or evidence if it's possible. I know that sounds bad because I'm trying to build a legal case, but what I'm trying to do is just make sure that, like, this person has a chance to be accountable and to,
mhm.
like, self-report in some extent, to some
Yeah.
extent, like, from a leadership perspective. But also, I really don't want to get to a he said, or he said, she said situation, right? I don't want to do that.
Mhm.
Like, my word against theirs doesn't really, I don't, that gets sticky, and that just causes even more division, especially if the person is going to really, die on that hill and they're not going to, like, acknowledge it. So I would try to, like, give myself, I don't want to say the upper hand, but the ability to, like, call it out from a real perspective. And then I would trust that I would hope and pray and trust that God would move in that person in such a way that they'd be willing to address it and have some kind of redemptive moment, and then see where it goes. Does that make sense? And that's like a really high
Yeah.
level. That's tough. Like, if it was another peer member on my staff, if it was like a person in my church and I was a pastor,
Mhm.
I might sit them down one on one individually and not tell a bunch of people. Like
Yeah.
I wouldn't create that extra system of accountability. I would just
Yeah.
make it one on one.
Well, that's where, the Bible does have a good
Oh,
example of this. Like,
yeah,
if you see something messed up, you have to confront that person individually. Then, if they don't listen, then you go talk to someone. So, I actually had a situation where I think I talked to you about this. I don't know if I mentioned it
yeah.
in a podcast or not, but there was a situation in my church where someone who was nominated for a position of leadership um, was witnessed by a couple in the church of doing something that was unbecoming of a leader in the church. It wasn't a huge, massive moral failing, but it was like, okay, like, do we really want that in a leader? So this couple came to me, told me about what happened, and I was not really expecting it. I wasn't really sure exactly what to do. I don't remember my exact response, but it was something akin to, um, I don't know if I could render judgment on this situation because I was not there. And even though I trust your word, I believe that what you told me actually happened, that this person did this thing. But as it stands, it's as far as I'm concerned, it's just hearsay. I do believe you, but I'm just letting you know I'm uncomfortable confronting this person on it because I was not the one who witnessed it. I says, now, if you want to confront him on it, like I fully support
You
you. I'll even be a
right.
moderator and I'll be in the room with you. But I personally can't address that situation because I'm just hearing it from you. So I don't really know what happened. Like I don't know
Yeah.
their side of the story either. And so that's how I approached that. Um, and I think that's fair. Like and I think what that couple did was fine. I would be confused in that situation. Like, what do you do? Do you just go directly and tell the pastor when you see someone making a mistake, or do you confront that individual? I would say it's fine to let the pastor know if you trust the pastor, just to give them a heads up or to give someone a heads up, like what you're saying, so at least someone knows what's going on, as long as it doesn't become gossip. But I would also say this: if you are someone who witnesses a moral failing and you are not willing to actually go to that person and just talk to them about it, then anything you say is just gonna be gossip, frankly. I mean, even if it's a messed up
Yeah.
situation, like, you have to be willing to go and confront that person, yourself. Like, I mean, whether or not you can,
Mm.
but you have to, like, at least make the effort. Like, I understand in some situations, like, okay, that church situation I mentioned earlier where the pastor is a very large church, pastor, messing around with minors, um I feel like sometimes people don't
That one.
realize that even in a large church, like, you still have a voice. The pastors are not people who are, like, untouchable. Like, you can actually make a meeting, like, set a meeting and actually go and talk with them. And sometimes I wonder if people don't realize that, or if they don't realize that that's an option, um, or if they just feel like the only option they have is just to talk to other people about it and hope someone actually does something. Like, no, you can actually take the initiative and do it yourself. Uh,
Mm.
so I guess I'll just add to encourage you, do that. But yeah, this is a difficult question. Maybe I shouldn't have asked it, but or maybe no, maybe I should have because I
No,
feel a
I'm
lot
glad
of
you did though.
people see issues happen, they just don't know what to do about it. And I would say that's a good thing to do is what you said. Like, talk to that person about it. Even if you
Literally
don't
thinking
know them
of
that
different
well,
churches
just
right
talk
now.
to them about it. Like get clarity. Like, dude, what's going on? This is what I'm seeing. What's happening? And if they don't
Yeah, it
listen,
looks
okay, then you have other avenues. You have other pastors, you have the church board, you have, you know, higher leadership, hopefully. And sometimes they don't do anything, but uh, you can't force something to happen, but
Ben,
there are
that's a good
options.
question. So I agree. I think there is a biblical mandate, or at least a biblical. No, I'll say mandate. I think there is a biblical calling and mandate to call people out on stuff, certain stuff, right?
Mhm,
I guess the question is like, I think a lot of people are afraid to do it because they're afraid of
yeah,
conflict.
mhm,
You know,
yeah,
um,
and it's easier to just gossip about it.
yeah, it is. What do you do in a situation where you are fearful that it might hurt a ministry? Because I think it's kind of the subtext we've
Mm,
talked about, like, but we've not really talked about it in that way. Like, oh man, this actually could go bad and it could hurt the ministry, the broader ministry. I don't think you should sweep it under the rug, but like, how does that, do you think that changes? Because I mean, you've been on staff, the dynamics of like how you have the conversation or the way you approach the problem. Because I'm trying to figure that out now, not that I have an actual issue with my church, because if
mm,
anybody's listening, that's not what I'm saying. But like, if that ever were to occur, Like, what would I do? Like, how do I handle that?
Yeah. That's where, sheesh.
Right? I
'Cause
know.
it affects the dynamic so much. Because it's someone that you work alongside, and I don't know, in those situations, like, church politics has a big part in decision making and, like, how you navigate that. Because some people are just gonna be defensive of someone else, and they're just not gonna listen, even though they should, but, it is what it is. Man, I don't know. You kinda just have to read the room a little bit, if you know what I mean.
Mm,
Like, some of
mm.
those complex situations, man, I don't know.
Right, it's a tough one. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that one. Actually, that's really rough. Because I was just thinking, like, I've been in a, like, it, I'm thinking about it in work, but like how it would affect if I volunteered. Like, I had a boss at a job that I no longer am at a long time ago. Actually, no, it's not you, Tony Fight Master. I love you, buddy. You're the best. But I had another boss at a different location when I was in Indy that was a bit of a micromanager. And by a bit, I mean they're a pretty big micromanager. And they would randomly just show up in your office and just make you give them a report of everything they did.
Hmm,
And like, I just felt like, they ruled by intimidation. That just created a weird work environment. Like, what if there was like a minute and like this person was an ex-pastor? Like, what if they ran a ministry like that? Like,
ugh,
holy cow. Like, that's not explicitly sinful, but it is, I think, like, it just seems wrong. I don't know where it seems wrong. I don't know how to define that it seems wrong, you know?
mhm,
You know what I'm saying, Ben? Like, how would you
yeah,
confront that person towards that person? Be like, hey, I don't think there's anything wrong with accountability, but like, maybe don't do it that way.
mhm,
Like, I don't know, like, how do you have that kind of conversation? Because like, you don't want to like throw this person under the bus, like, or like if they're vindictive, you don't want to not be part of the ministry, especially if you believe in what they're doing, you know? Like, I
mhm,
believed in the cause of the business. I was a Christian organization. I liked what they were doing, but I was kind of like, oh, I don't, this isn't how we should be managing our day-to-day operations to accomplish a goal I agree with, Does that
yeah.
make sense what I'm saying? It's
Yeah,
not a church, but it could be a church, right?
right. Yeah, like, I feel you. So, yeah, I guess in a situation like that, like, you just find someone who's in a position of leadership that you can confide in,
Mm.
and this is how I would respond to that, and I would just talk to them, and I'd be like, "Okay, am I just off base here?" And just sort of bring up the situation and being
Like,
like, it's like,
give me some wisdom.
yeah, like, sort of, have someone else in the conversation, not as gossip, but just, because maybe there's someone who could be like, "Yeah, actually, here's a good way to approach it," or maybe they could even go talk to them themselves. This is where I actually appreciate the Kenyan model of confrontation. So, when I was in Kenya, I wrote a blog post that, unbeknownst to me, offended one of my friends who lived there. I guess I said something that was a bit culturally insensitive, which I didn't realize at the time. So, I was out with someone else. We were just walking down. They said, "Oh, so about your last blog post, so and so was a bit offended by that and yada yada yada." And I was like, "Oh man, like I feel really bad. That's not what I intended. Like this is what I was trying to say." And like I was not trying to be offensive at all, and I totally understand, so and so's position. And so like there was like a mediator there, and that's how conflict is handled a lot over there. Like people don't just go to you and be like, "I was offended, let me tell you about it." That's much more Western. Um, but, over there, there's,
Or
like,
tweet about it.
mediators involved, which I think is a good, model to kind of think about when dealing with those uncomfortable situations, is maybe getting a third party who can sort of mediate.
No, man, I think it was really well said. I think it's cool to handle things with a mediator. I wonder, what is it in Matthew? Gosh, I'm so bad about this. It's like, if a
Oh,
brother
the
sins
discipline
against you,
one?
confront him once, and then like, if not, get a third person, and then come back and have the discussion again, the mediator. So, do you
Yeah,
think that maybe like, I don't know, because I don't want to like be super literal to the point of like can't function, but also like realistic, in the sense that like we should be following this.
yeah.
Do you think that person should have said something to you first? Like, hey, Ben, like, I think that's a little culturally insensitive, man. And then had a chance to hash it out with you before they brought in a mediator, or no? Or do you think it was handled really well? I don't know. God's
Uh,
bigger than that, I suppose. That's such a cop out, but it's true.
yeah.
Like,
Well, funny enough, that whole passage of "Where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, there I am with them," is, not necessarily a passage that's comforting churches to be like, oh, even if there's just two of you, I'm there too. It's actually in the context of church discipline. So it's actually a pretty good
Oh, interesting.
reference of like, yeah, of being like, okay. And this is in the context of, if someone sins, like if, your brother or sister sins, you need to go to them and talk to them. If they don't listen, then you need to bring along a few other people who are, privy to the situation who can talk to them. And then, the next level is, then you go to the whole church and you have to deal with it there. And then that's where the whole context of for where two or three are gathered, there I am with them, essentially saying, in those situations, you know, God's active in helping discern what's going on. So just a fun little scriptural fact for you. Um,
Mm,
but yeah. So, all this to say, if you actually witness something in the church, there are things you can do. If you're really offended by it, rather than just sitting back and just complaining to someone and, which is totally ineffectual, like, actually addressing it, either talk to that person individually or, talk to someone who could be a mediator to talk to that person, like do something. Cause I do feel, I think you would agree with this, that maybe there's a third option here where sometimes people are too quick to drop the hammer. Sometimes people are too quick to just dole out grace. And sometimes people are too quick to just sit back, not do anything, and just complain about a situation. Uh,
yeah, because that's not solving anything either. That's just burying your head in the sand and then just causing more. Well, it's not only burying your head. It's either burying your head in the sand or it's just stirring up problems in the background, and
yeah,
that's the gossip portion of it. All of that. None of this is good. Uh,
right.
none of this is good.
Yeah. Um, true. So all that to say, when it
Have the
comes
tough
to
combos.
yeah, when it comes to moral failures from church leaders, it's tricky, but at the same time, it's
Kind of
almost
clear.
like dealing with anything else. Like, they're people too. I think I know a lot of times they're like, oh well, we don't put our pastors on pedestals or anything like that. But I think most of the time we do.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah.
Yeah, we 100
And
percent
so
do.
like when they fall, we feel like they deserve punishment more than anybody else. Or less than anybody else. And that's not right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. No,
So
you're not wrong. I think people do that. I think it's like implicit. It happens on accident because you go to them for like spiritual wisdom, and in some sense, I think that you just can't help yourself but not seeing them
mhm,
in a different light. You know,
mhm,
um, and I think it's why good leaders are really humble leaders. Good pastors are really humble, and they tell you when they're wrong about stuff, and they're open to say stuff like that. And that doesn't just have to be like moral failures. Like
mhm.
if I think it would go a long way for pastors. This is just my 2 cents now. If you made a bad decision that caused like let's say you wanted to start a new ministry and it just tanked, just was not a good idea and nothing
Mhm.
about it was good. You could be like, if you just went up there and like, you had your next vision Sunday or whatever where you're laying out the year, be like, so last year we did this and it was my idea to do X, Y, and Z and it tanked. And you just said that outright and say, hey, here's where I messed up. This is how I want to change things. I feel like people would be really appreciative of that level of
Oh yeah.
vulnerability. And
Yeah.
they'd be like, oh man, like, okay, it's good. And then it brings you down to a human level where they can like address you in a more meaningful way. I think that's just being a good leader in general. But I think that'd be a really good pastoral step. And I think it allows for a place of, grace and redemption too. Because like, I think we treat pastors like kind of like businesses, boards treat CEOs, like in companies, like in a business where like, if you don't get our church to like 700 people in like 6 weeks and we started at like, 200, then like, I mean, are you even good? Could you even pastor, bro? Like,
Yeah.
like, no, like that's not how that works, and there's more
Mhm.
to it than that. And so like, I think we just got to move that. I think it's hard though. I mean, like, I don't know. It's interesting to me. This is not related, but now I'm just on a tangent, so forgive me. I feel like a lot of people that are on boards like tend to be big time givers, and they tend to have like business backgrounds.
Mhm.
And that's not to say that they're wrong and stuff. Obviously, they're very successful and they're doing some things economically right,
Yeah.
and they can even be really great people. In fact, most of them probably are. But
Mhm.
like, I don't think that you can always run it that way and think of the church that way because I think that would create that. I think it does create, and it has, in my experience, created really unhealthy
Mhm.
expectations and practices and boundaries. And it also absolves the body from responsibility and puts it on a minister when the reality is that all Christians are called to be the hands and feet of Christ. So my
Yeah.
job's not to just, hey, come to church. My pastor's going to preach a good message. You're going to get saved. Like, it's not like that. That's not how that works. Like you need to be involved in your community to an individual level. And that doesn't
Yeah.
mean just having events at your church that you show up at. That means like you going and doing stuff. Like if there's a kid that wants to go to church that can't,
Mhm.
give them a ride. That sounds stupid and dumb, but that's not a church organized event. Nor is it like, you just picking them up with the expectation that someone else is going to fix them. Like you're getting involved in their life. You're giving them a ride. You're trying to help a hardship that obviously is difficult for them. They can't afford a car. Maybe their mom works and they can't, get off work easy enough, or they don't work good hours to get their kid over there. And this kid can't come, but they're okay with you taking them. Like that's addressing a hardship that they didn't even know was a problem. Does that make sense? Like,
Mhm.
and it's small, but it's an example of the kind of creativity and just like small little self-sacrifices, how that goes a long way, like, or a family, that doesn't go to the church, that like someone loses their job and it's going to be tight, and you heard about it and you used to work with them, like you and like three of the people in your church make some casseroles for them for like a couple weeks, cost you like extra $5-10 to make a casserole at the grocery store. You give it to them, you're saving them money for groceries because they have pre-planned meals so they can go do other things. Like they can maybe take the time to have their oldest child pop that into the oven while they go to a job
Mhm.
interview, and they open up, what I'm saying? Like that sounds like small, but like it's
Yeah.
real. It's a real thing. Like do it. Like that's important. But that's
Mhm.
not systematic stuff. That's not you just like relying on them. That's not treating it as a business. I don't know. That was a big rant. That really went a different direction. But
It's
I don't
okay.
know. Does that
I mean,
make
I
got
think
some
it all
ties?
builds off the general point that we're making with this podcast. I think we could probably wrap it up here,
Thanks,
which is that,
man.
which is that like the church is a community, and being a community, pastors
Mhm.
are just as much of people as anybody else.
Yeah, it's not. It's a society. It's not a society, right? It doesn't have a government. Like we
Yeah.
have some of those rules because it's convenient and it's helpful. It's useful, but
Mhm.
it's a community. It's a kingdom. It's a group of people, and then we're all subject to somebody who's greater than all of us. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the PB&J podcast. If you like this episode, be sure to leave a like, also leave a comment, subscribe, and share. That'll really help us out. And let us know what your thoughts are on this subject. And also, if you have any ideas of topics you'd like us to talk about. If you want to reach out to us, you can on all of our social medias, as well as email. You can email us at official.pbjpodcast@gmail.com. And we will see you next time.